Is this going to be the worst card in the history of Marvel Snap? And is this one going to be the biggest? Those are a couple of the questions I hope to answer in this video, because the latest batch of datamined cards have been revealed in today's Marvel Snap patch, which means we've got 5 new cards to look at. I want to go through all of them, talk about the potential implications, power levels for these cards. We're going to rank them from those I think are going to have the biggest impact to the lowest impact, like this guy. And as always, keep in mind, these are not final. These numbers can change. Frankly, the text can still change till these are formally revealed. Assume there are possible changes. That said, these are usually pretty close to reality when all is said and done. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into our first card here, Blob. And I have to say, it's nice to finally have a card, made in my image here with Blob. He is a 6/3, the crazy on reveal. Merge your deck into this and gain its total power. Ongoing, can't be moved. So Blob is literally just going to eat the cards in your deck. That merge text is like what we have with Hulkbuster, so the stats are just going to get kind of absorbed there onto Blob, which obviously means if you have a deck stacked with a bunch of giant stuff, Blob can be absolutely enormous, because he can be your Infinite and your Giganto and your Magneto and so on and so forth, depending on the power levels, the qualities, the costs of the cards remaining in your deck. So you could definitely see this as an option, a kind of backup plan or a bonus plan, even for something like a Hela deck that's already stacking their deck with a bunch of really big cards. And inevitably there are a few left in the deck at the end of the game. Blob eats those and becomes a really nice threat. Maybe you got Tribunal in there as well too, to help distribute some of those Blob stats, so you're not overcommitted to any one given spot. So basically, if you have a bunch of heavy hitters and you don't draw them, Blob gives you an out to still make sure you're getting that Infinite no matter what, well, at least as long as you have Blob in hand. Now, obviously, there is some deck construction required to really make this work. If you get a bunch of small stuff, Blob's not going to feel very good. You get 3 1-drops on this. Blob's not going to be tiny necessarily, maybe +6 makes him a 6/9. It's, Chavez stat line or something, but you're not excited. It's really going to need to have some of that bigger stuff. So like ongoing cards, Darkhawks and stuff aren't going to look as good. You want those big raw stat lines. So I do think that probably makes Blob a fairly deck exclusive kind of card. In other words, I don't think everybody can just toss this in and hope for the best, because some decks just have too many low cost and low power, and ongoing effects where this wouldn't work necessarily very well. On reveal effects too, of course, can have some pretty low power stat lines. So, specific homes that kind of Hela build, that sort of big package, you're going to have some of those heavy hitters to really make Blob feel worth it. And that said, I still feel like this is a pretty big commitment, because number one, like some, locations can screw you, drawing you extra cards. Your opponent can draw you extra cards. In other words, you might not have much of anything left in your deck. And then, just dropping a singular big threat on turn 6 these days feels like Goliath bait. Goliath can just work right through that. It's not susceptible to Arrow, I guess, with this ongoing effect, which is a small bonus, but one I think is probably not ultimately all that relevant on occasion. There are maybe some ideas here too, with like cheating this out and then, following it up with a Taskmaster to help get some bonus stats. But then if you got Taskmaster in a Blob deck and he's still in the deck, that's another bad card for Blob to eat. So just as you can see, some like clunkiness there. That said, adding that extra layer of consistency to a Hela deck, that extra high roll, could be beneficial. And Hela decks are actually kind of underrated right now, I think. So all in all, for me, this card looks insanely fun. Like, the idea of making a giant dude is awesome, but I think fairly specific and narrow in its use cases. I don't think a lot of decks are going to be able to utilize this successfully. Feels a little bit easily countered or ignored or played around, and as such, pretty limited use, but maybe very good in those specific instances. So let's go ahead and get this guy out of the way too. This is Havok, and I'm not much of a believer in this card just yet. He's a 2/1, and he reads, after each turn, you lose 1 max energy, and this gains 3 power. So let's talk about how that's going to work, right? If you were to play this on turn 2, which, for the record, I don't think you ever really want to do. But if you were, then you'd go into turn 3 and you'd be down 1 max energy, so you still have 2 energy, right? And then you go into turn 4 and you try to go up to 3, but at the end of the turn, Havok's going to steal another energy. You'd stay at 2. So basically, if you play this on 2, you stay at 2 for the rest of the game. If you play this on 3, you stay at 3 for the rest of the game. So on and so forth, which means you're kind of trying to find, I think, a sweet spot here where you maybe don't mind that energy sacrifice. So for instance, if you played Havok on turn 5, and you were kind of okay with having 5 energy on turn 6, that wouldn't be much of a total sacrifice, and Havok would still scale up. There is a little bit of a question whether or not this actually scales on turn 6 as well, like at the end of turn 6. I think it will. I think even though there is no next turn, you can still technically pull from your max energy. So, for instance, if you played this on turn 5, I do think this would become a 2/7 by the end of the game. We don't know that for sure, but that's my reading. And you'd only be really sacrificing like 1 total energy for a 2/7, which that's actually pretty good, right? 2/7, that holds up well. It's maybe not that like Elsa or Angela stat line we're looking at these days, but it's okay. Now, that said, I hate that the card can only be played in really specific instances or it starts to punish you really hard. So being unable to play your 2-cost card on turn 2, that can sometimes feel bad. You want to fill energy. You want to make sure you're being energy efficient and spending as much energy as you can. And with a card like this, you're kind of just stuck sometimes with it in hand, waiting for that right moment, or perhaps feeling pressured or taking a risk playing it out earlier than you'd like. And then, of course, really limiting your turns down the road. And, ultimately, you can't get by playing this on 2. Yes, it's going to gain a bunch of energy all by itself, but you probably won't have enough to win the game elsewhere. Although that does sound like a pretty fun challenge, I have to say. So basically this card starts creating limitations on itself immediately. And when we have a game where we see time and time again that energy efficiency, cheap cards, discounted cards, spamming cards, playing as much as possible late in the game, all of those are really strong tenets in Marvel Snap. Those are the things that tend to be the top of the meta time and time again. This goes against the grain on that, and I don't think it offers you enough upside in return. Like this +3 power being isolated to a single spot. Frankly, if you play it too early, it gets to like Shang-Chi range, and Shadow King is an easy answer to this sort of card. So you're sort of paying all this price, but you're not necessarily getting much out of it in return. And what you do get out of it feels pretty easily answered and really specific because it's limited to a single location. So ultimately, the kind of risk-reward equation here and balance on this card feels off to me. I think you're paying way too high of a penalty here for ultimately a pretty limited upside. That said, I'm curious if you guys are seeing some other lines for this one, some kind of synergy that's, doubling up on this, expanding on this, making this more effective than it seems in my eyes, because right now it just doesn't look very good. So moving on, this is actually the season pass card for the month of December, where these cards are going to live, and could have done this one first, but I thought the other 2 cards were a little bit more interesting at the very least. This is Sebastian Shaw. He's a 3/3. And it reads, when this card permanently gains power, gain +2 more power wherever this is. So talking about that text there, that basically means the difference between, say, this getting buffed by Blue Marvel. That is kind of an aura on-board effect. It's not permanently attached to the card, versus getting buffed by Ironheart. That is stats that are going to be applied directly to Sebastian Shaw. They live on the card and therefore become permanent. So if you hit this with an Ironheart, for instance, it's going to get +4 instead of +2. If you hit this with Blue Marvel, it just goes up to 3/4 as expected, no extra bonuses. And of course, there's a few ways to buff cards. In the instance of Sebastian Shaw, we've got, the Ironhearts of the world. Silver Surfer is a really good fit with this as a 3-cost card. So any of those card-based effects, but also keep in mind, this can actually benefit a lot from locations. Think about something like Muir Island on this, where Muir Island is buffing this at the end of every single turn with a permanent buff. That means Muir Island is giving this +3 every turn instead of just +1. That could be absolutely crazy for Sebastian Shaw, and there are certainly a few different locations that benefit. I think there are also some cool plays with this, with like the kind of hand buff or deck buff with Okoye, Nakia. Basically, even if this is in deck, because it says wherever this is, if you hit this with an Okoye buff, you're going to draw this as a 3/6 instead of a 3/3, which is actually kind of nuts. That feels really good. So I could see this being utilized in a deck with a variety of different buff options, Forges, Silver Surfers, Okoyes, whatever it might be. There's a few different directions you could go, because this does become a threat all in its own right and starts to carry a location probably on its own. Like, you dump this in a Surfer deck, you hit it with Ironheart Surfer, you've got yourself a bit of a carry right there on Sebastian Shaw alone. And certainly there are lots of other ways to support this. So that's a pretty interesting card. We're also going to take a look at another card that probably benefits from buffs in similar sorts of ways. There might even be a specific deck coming together there in this season between Sebastian Shaw and this card, Firestar. This one's a pretty crazy new 6-drop. She has 3 power, and on reveal, each card you played last turn gains this card's power. So she is a 3 power card. That means if you played 5 1-drops on turn 5, they would each gain +3 power. I don't believe it sets their power to 3. Looking at the wording of this, it's pretty distinct and pretty clear that they should gain the +3, which obviously that would be +15 if you played 5 cards on turn 5. Firestar herself is, 3 power. That would be kind of a 618 total power output spread across multiple locations. Obviously, that would be nuts. Now, of course, playing 5 cards on turn 5 is not an easy or trivial sort of thing to do. Absolutely not impossible, though. And certainly some cards benefit that more than others. Things like Mysterio. We've seen time and time again, Mysterio counts as having multiple cards played. That's why it works so well with Hitmonkey and Bishop. Could work really well with Firestar as well. You play a Mysterio alongside a Hitmonkey on turn 5. Maybe not the Hitmonkey. Maybe a few 1-drops to go with it. Firestar comes down. I think it's very easy to get 4, 5, 6 buffs out of your Firestar, which obviously, again, that's just kind of crazy. You get 6 buffs out of this. That's +18 on top of the Firestar. And again, spread out across the board as well. So making a big commitment. So there's some actually really nuts kind of like reverse miracle sort of plays where you're spamming all the cards out first and then dropping the Firestar. Whereas normally we kind of save up all that spam for turn 6. Which is kind of cool and a little bit different. Now, also keep in mind, of course, this is not fixed at 3 power. Like we talked about with Sebastian Shaw, you run an Okoye, you run a Nakia, whatever it is, you're pushing this number upward. If this becomes 4, 5, 6 power in hand, you could even forge this on turn 5, play the Firestar on 6, it becomes 6 power. That Forge gains 6 power. You could play Mysterio alongside that Forge as well. Each Mysterio gains 6 power off the Firestar. Like, that is actually crazy. You could do some big bonkers numbers off the back of Firestar, and it doesn't take much to make it worth it. Like in the Forge instance, like a Forge plus 2 small cards on turn 5 makes Firestar completely insane, like Doctor Doom plus level kind of card. So ultimately, this looks like an amazing finisher. This looks like it has a ton of potential to me. At a base level, I think it looks pretty good. And then if you start to support it with additional buffs or whatever, sky's the limit. This card could be actually completely nuts. Fits that kind of bounce package mold as well. So we've already seen some deck shapes that make a lot of sense for this. I'm wondering if a card like Mysterio can survive. He's already so good right now with Elsa and everybody else. With a card like this, Mysterio might actually just be too nuts. So keep an eye out, I guess, if Mysterio gets nerfed or changed or mechanically or something. Maybe this card looks a little bit weaker, but frankly, I think there's still plenty of potential otherwise, because it's not crazy to play 2 or 3 things on turn 5 and make this feel really worth it. Forge kind of chief among them. So next up here, we have Selene, who has quickly become my favorite all-time Marvel Snap card. I'll let you guess why. She is a 1 energy, -1 power card. Pretty crazy stat line there. And a really crazy on reveal, too. Afflict the lowest power card in each player's hand with -3 power. So you're going to debuff something in your opponent's hand. I mean, ideally you want to hit like an Iron Man. That's 0 power. You give Iron Man -3. Iron Man feels like complete and utter garbage. But in any case, even if you don't hit something like an Iron Man, whatever their card is they want to play, suddenly it becomes a real risk for them. Might be something they can keep in hand, might make their life awkward. Other times they may feel like they have to play it if it's a Cerebro or something that's fundamental to their deck. So you might just net that nice -3. Now that said, of course, you're also paying the penalty yourself with a -3 power adjustment to one of your cards. I guess you could technically play this on an empty hand and feel okay-ish, but most often, of course, you're going to have something you hit as well. which is obviously a downside. Now, there's a few ways, as we know, to work around those sort of downsides. We already see this in these kind of junk affliction decks. So you've got things like Viper. You could debuff one of your cards and then Viper it over to your opponent's side of the board. You've got stuff like Eating. You can play Carnage to eat off those negative stat lines, so you're not worried about it. You know, debuff a Hood, play the Hood, get the Demon, Carnage the Hood, even though it's -6, you're totally fine. Also, keep in mind, this card was previously discussed in one of our previous leaked card, datamined card videos. This is Annihilus. He's going to come out before Selene. Remember this on reveal: your cards with 0 or less power switch sides, destroy those that can't. So boom, debuff a card, give it negative power. Selene herself has negative power. Slam that Annihilus on turn 5. Fill up your opponent's board with absolute garbage. They get this -1 that occupies a spot, something with -3, or perhaps even worse stat lines that occupies a spot. And you can see the stack coming together really nicely and actually kind of terrifyingly. I feel like this is the sort of thing that could get really frustrating if it's too good. So that said, you know, Selene, I think, is a card that's going to be pretty hard to utilize in most scenarios outside of that very specific junky affliction deck. Probably even has to have Annihilus to feel really worth it. So you're talking about an incredibly narrow band of decks and archetypes here that can support this. Basically one deck, one archetype, I think, where this makes any sense. Which doesn't necessarily mean the card is bad. It might be very functional in that archetype, but it just means that, you know, number one, you have to have a lot of supporting cards to make that good. A lot of people may not have both Annihilus and Selene in their collections. It's just kind of hard sometimes to get both of those cards. But beyond that, you know, it's really meta dependent. Some metas might mean this is a garbage combo that's not any good at all. Other times it might just be okay at best. So one of those cards that's fun to have for sure. I think there will be moments where this deck feels pretty cool and frankly a little bit evil, but I don't think we see this all the time, which as far as I'm concerned is going to be a shame. So that said, I wanted to go through and rank these cards from the ones I think are going to be the best to the worst. I think the number 1 card is going to be Firestar. This looks like an incredible finisher. My number 2 card is Sebastian Shaw. I think this could be a bit of a carry 3-drop that fits into a lot of shells pretty naturally right now. My number 3 card is Blob. I think a questionable finisher of sorts for big stat decks, which already have a hard time at the top of the meta very often. My number 4 card here is Selene. This looks like a card that's really restricted to a singular deck, which is certainly going to limit its utility. And my number 5 card here is Havok. I think this one's going to be really challenging to play. His best case scenarios are still rather limiting from a curve standpoint and from a deck construction standpoint. So I don't see this one getting there at all. And there you go. Those are the latest leaked datamined cards from the newest Marvel Snap patch. These are going to be landing in the month of December. I don't know the dates or orders or whatever, other than Sebastian being the season pass card, it seems. So pretty fun stuff. I think this card looks kind of nuts to me, and a couple of other of these look really fun, like Blob and Selene both look very entertaining, and I'm going to enjoy playing them a lot, even if their power level's not necessarily super high. So not quite as strong as some of the recent months we've had, as far as I can tell, but maybe as fun as some of the recent months we've had. So all that said, curious to hear your thoughts on these cards. What angle do you see for these that I missed? What decks do you think are going to be able to use these really well? Are there going to be any surprise standouts? Want to hear all that and more in the comments below. Thanks so much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.